Next delegation is Kaitlyn Mitchell, who's appearing on the same item. Good morning, Kaitlyn. You have up to 10 minutes to make your presentation, starting now. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Kaitlyn Mitchell. I am a staff lawyer with Animal Justice. Animal Justice is Canada's leading national animal law organization. And although Animal Justice is based in Toronto, I'm actually based here in Winnipeg. The first thing that I wanted to mention today was some polling, actually, that Animal Justice had conducted along with World Animal Protection. And I had hoped to share those results with you on my screen, but I understand I'm not allowed to share my screen. So perhaps what I'll do is I will just...
Not true, you can share your screen.
Because I had some correspondence this morning. I understand that
because you didn't share it ahead of time.
I didn't share the PowerPoint ahead of time. Unfortunately, I shared our written submissions ahead of time. So I'd be happy to share my screen, but I don't want to push to violate any rules. So alternatively, I could just read through the polling results and then
go ahead
with you after. Shall I read through them?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so I will share these with you afterwards, as I said, because we do have some very fancy and helpful pie charts that come along with polling. But so as I said, so we had this polling conducted. It was actually conducted at the end of last year by Nanos Research, and it was a survey of Winnipeg residents. And I think it's important for council to be aware that the poll did find that a strong majority of residents want the city to regulate cat and dog breeders. So when asked specifically whether they support the city regulating cat and dog breeders, including by requiring that they obtain a permit and demonstrate a history of responsible breeding, 89.5% of residents indicated that they do support or somewhat support this proposal. And only 4% actually of those surveys were opposed to the proposal. So that's a really resounding result, I would say. And it shows that the city, I would hope, should move on that. The other issue that we had polled was on lethal wildlife traps. So again, when asked whether they support a ban on the outdoor use of wildlife traps in the city, 65.8% of respondents indicated that they either support or somewhat support such a ban. And it's interesting to note, and again, I don't have you can't see the numbers, so I'll just tell you, the ban was supported across all age groups, but it was actually in the 55 and over age range that there was the highest support. So based on the results, and I realize those are focused on two very specific areas only, but based on those results, I would suggest that when it comes to regulating cat and dog breeders in the city, as well as banning the outdoor use of wildlife traps, not only is it the right thing to do, as I will explain momentarily, but it would also help to bring Winnipeg's responsible pet ownership bylaw in line with the values of residents. Now, we've heard a lot this morning about wildlife traps, and I'd like to move on to discuss those. And I had also hoped to share, and again, I'll just share this after, photographs of the different types of traps that are available, because I think it's important for us to know what we're talking about when we talk about wildlife traps. So the proposal that was originally consulted on back in the summer talked about a ban on lethal traps. And when you look at the public consultation document, it looks like there was strong support for a ban on lethal traps. But I did note that the proposal that's being put forward today, which I understand we'll be discussing later, the wording focuses on body hold traps. So I'm not sure if that is intentional or not, but I did just want to flag that that leaves a little bit of ambiguity in my mind, and I think that the wording probably needs to be clarified a bit. So the reasoning is this, and again, I'll share the photographs later so that you can understand what we're talking about, but there are different types of lethal traps, and as I understand it, body hold traps are one type of those traps, and they're commonly known as Kona bear traps, and that's the type of traps that you heard about this morning from Kathy, who had an absolutely horrific experience. But sadly, they're not the only trap that we should be concerned about. And so I would suggest that when drafting the actual bylaw, we should make sure that it also includes a ban on leg hold traps. Those are commonly referred to as restraining traps. So basically, What those do is they catch an animal by the limb and they immobilize the animal so they can't eat or drink, care for their young, fend off predators, shelter themselves from the elements. So this is an incredibly painful and distressing experience, needless to say. Animals can die eventually, but it takes a long time. They can die from hypothermia, dehydration, and so forth. And those are banned in approximately 88 countries around the world, as well as approximately 9 US states. You've heard a lot about Kona bear traps today. Those traps are actually designed to be more humane than the leg hold traps that I just mentioned. And as you heard from Kathy this morning, they are anything but. They do kill animals, but it is often not instantaneous. So it is certainly my hope that the city will proceed with a ban that includes body hold or Kona bear traps. And then there's also snare traps. So those are like a wire loop that tightens around the animal as they try to free themselves, and they can die by slow strangulation. But sometimes non-target animals, like a deer, for instance, will get caught in these traps and it goes around their leg. So again, we're talking about prolonged and unnecessary suffering. And then finally, I would note that there are cuff-style traps that are often used for raccoons, and they're marketed as dog safe because the shape of them, I guess, is too small generally to catch dogs. But they go around the animal's leg. They are not cat safe. So again, when we're talking about animal suffering and companion animals in particular, these traps are all non-discriminate. They all cause prolonged suffering. So if we are moving forward to bring Winnipeg law in conformity with the values of residents, I would say to you that we just need to make sure that we capture all of those types of traps in the city and just allow the use of live traps only. So I'll move on, conscious of time, and just mention that we do also support the proposed ban on the outdoor use of glue traps. I would suggest to you that glue traps should be banned entirely. Sorry, I'm having a pet issue behind me, which is very fitting. I would suggest that glue traps should be banned entirely. A ban on the outdoor use of glue traps is important, and that's a really good first step, but these are incredibly inhumane traps. If you've seen them, the animal gets adhered to the trap, and then the more that they try to free themselves, the more adhered they get. It takes a long time to die, sometimes more than 24 hours. They can rip off skin, fur, or feathers as they try to free themselves. And of course, when these traps are used outside in particular, it's hard to control what types of animals are going to be caught. So there are many, many instances where birds have been caught on these traps, amphibians, even kittens. So again, I would certainly implore you to support the ban on the outdoor use of glue traps, but I would suggest that the indoor use of glue traps should be banned as well. And you've also heard about rodenticides this morning, and Brittany did an excellent job at summarizing why those should also be banned in the city. I would note that in the consultation document, it states that BC instituted an 18-month ban on second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides in particular. And that's because, as you've heard, they've caused tremendous suffering, but they're also quite dangerous to other animals. And in BC in particular, there were a lot of concerns about the number of owls that were ingesting poisoned rodents and then themselves succumbing to secondary poisoning. So very briefly, we also support the regulation of cat and dog breeders. And in my written comments, I've set out some suggestions in terms of some additional points to consider. But suffice it to say that the unregulated breeding of cats and dogs is a significant problem throughout Canada. Winnipeg is no exception. That contributes to unnecessary euthanasia. It also puts a significant burden on animal shelters in the city, as you've heard. So we do support the city taking steps to regulate that. And I did just want to note that if you look at the Animal Care Act, the provincial statute, there are some licensing requirements in there, but I want to be clear that those licensing requirements, A, are not as stringent as what's being proposed here, but B, they're not actually enforced. So the province stopped enforcing them in about 2012. They suspended the whole licensing regime, which was a bit surprising to me. I didn't know that until I started looking into it. But we did follow up with the province to ask them about it, and they did confirm that they're still not enforcing that requirement. So I just don't want there to be any any thought that this is somehow duplicative, because it's not. And finally, I just have a few seconds, so I will just note we do, of course, support the ban on 24/7 tethering of dogs and outdoor housing of dogs. We also support the development of standards for dog daycares and also the ban on keeping dogs and cats in cold and hot vehicles.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions, councillors?
Kaitlyn, is it?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for your presentation this morning.
My pleasure.
Over this past summer, and more so this past summer, because of the dryness, the drought-like conditions that were presented throughout this province, we've seen more and more wildlife coming into the city area as a result. On my social media page, I get a lot of sightings of coyotes, fox. The urban deer population is unlike I've ever seen in the city before. Would you have any recommendations on how to control that? Because again, for some of them, the coyotes and potentially fox, they can have an impact on some of our smaller animals as well. And I mean, people are posting on social media of these sightings, warning people to bring their pets inside or to supervise their pets when they're outdoors. So are there any suggestions that you might have in terms of mitigating the concerns that are raised with the wildlife that has been coming into the city seeking food sources as a result of the dry conditions that we're experiencing throughout this province?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Certainly I want to be clear that I'm a lawyer, and I certainly don't profess to have any expertise in terms of broader wildlife control issues. But what I can certainly say is this: there are plenty of non-lethal, non-harmful options when it comes to controlling wildlife coming into the city. As someone, I have my own companion animals. You saw behind me, I had to control a situation during my presentation. So I share that concern. But in many cities, this is a concern that's not unique to Winnipeg. And I would say, contacting the city, for instance, and having actual professionals come out and help with the situation is important, or contacting a wildlife control company who will do non-lethal measures to address the situation is also an available option. So I think certainly it is an issue, and it's certainly one that deserves our attention. But there can be no justification for setting lethal wildlife traps on private property in the hope that the animal that happens to be caught happens to be this specific animal that is identified as the problem animal, and then setting aside the whole other factor, which is that these are sentient beings, and it's just completely inexcusable to permit anyone to suffer such an excruciating death, regardless of whether you are catching the animal that you intend to catch or not. So all this to say, I agree it's a very serious issue, but I think that there are non-lethal ways to address those situations, and I don't think that there's any justification for using these types of traps in the city of Winnipeg.
Thank you.
Thank you.